Hey everyone, I'm Real Prism Sword, and I wanted to make a series that took a look at different Legends of Runeterra cards and listed them in different categories. I took inspiration from Nitahone's MTG Top 10, and despite not playing too much Magic myself, I'm still a fan of his content as the series does a great job of providing insight at the history of the game and cards within it. So I thought to try and make a similar series for Runeterra. While his list uses empirical evidence to sort cards by how many top spots they found in higher competition, trying to initially compile a database that has the past few years of seasonals and open tournaments with an LOR would be a difficult undertaking to start up by myself. So I wanted this first list to be less exact numbers and more looking at game concepts. In today's list, I'm looking at LOR cards that were initially thought to be unviable, but through one reason or another, eventually became strong and popular and led them to see competitive play. This can be because of cards around them getting nerfed or buffed, systems being changed, or a new supporting card getting released. However, there was one exception that I wanted to have that would exclude a card from being able to appear on this list. I did not want to add cards that were buffed into relevancy, like Blood for Blood or Echo. The reason being is that in a game like Runeterra with live balancing, a buff has an intention to make the card good. This list is looking more at the natural ways a card finds competitive life after being skipped over for so long. With all that out of the way, let's get a look at the list. At number 10, we have Ging Cobra. As the newest card in this list, releasing in the Glory and Navori Variety mini set, Ging Cobra didn't have too many opportunities to make a name for itself. But as time passed, it was quickly apparent that it wouldn't really be able to find a stable spot in the meta outside of meme lists, as it was just too slow to really abuse the big stats and great keywords it could obtain if given enough time. This status of ineffective card would not change until the next Variety mini set that came out during Har the Huntress in August, which would introduce the card known as Valley of Imitation. The Valley could come down as soon as turn 3, and once on the board it had a devious combo with the Beguiling Cobra. The Valley would transform into the Cobra when played, and then it would activate the effect, which would fill the board with Cobras, making your board 6 wide in one action, and raise the Valley's stats. At performing the combo, if your opponent wasn't already dead, you could then use this incredibly buffed Valley and give your other Cobras a strong keyword like Elusive or Overwhelm, and then kill your opponent. At number 9, we have Dracor Inquisitor, which was released back at the first Empires the Ascended set alongside Lissandra. While Lissandra saw immediate competitive success, she did so without Dracor Inquisitor with the deck known as Trundle Lissandra Control, shortened to TLC. To summarize this deck, the Frozen Thrall aspect of Lissandra was pretty much ignored, as the deck paired up with Shadow Isles to quickly level up Lissandra thanks to Trundle's Ice Pillar and Fading Memories. You could then cheat out the Watcher as soon as possible thanks to cards like Spectral Matron, then attack with it to mill out your opponent's entire deck and have them lose the next turn. Sometimes this could happen as soon as round 8. Eventually, the deck would eat different nerfs throughout its lifespan, with the two major changes hitting the Watcher itself. One nerfing the Watcher effect, which now leaves only a few cards instead of obliterating the entire enemy deck, and the other nerf, increasing the amount of 8 costed units needed to reduce the Watcher to 0 mana. After these nerfs, Lissandra would eventually find relevancy again by ditching Trundle and Shadow Isles, instead turning to Shrima and focus in on the Thrall's aspect of her kit. Shrima would have multiple ways to advance landmarks thanks to release of Zillion and turbo out the Thralls, and Dracor Inquisitor was a key component to this, since once the countdown was low enough, the Inquisitor would accelerate the Thralls and quickly make lethal presenting boards. There were also other cards released throughout the years, like Harbinger of Thralls, which helped improve the consistency of Frozen Thralls. While Frozen Thralls and surrounding support cards would eat nerfs, the deck would still appear throughout certain metas as a popular counter option, and whenever it does show, it usually has the Inquisitor playing a key role within it. At number 8, we have Voice of the Risen. This follower never saw any play during her initial release back at the start of the Empires the Ascended expansion, as she'd been overshadowed by other power boosting options that wanted to empower wider boards. This was accentuated back when Azir Relia was at its heyday, the expansion afterwards. The duo would quickly conjure up wide boards with a ton of free attacks, and the deck would be empowered by level 2 Azir or Inspiring Marshal. After the nerf to Inspiring Marshal, the deck would then turn to Voice of the Risen to try and give a constant power boost to the Blades and Sand Soldiers, since it wasn't too hard to level up Azir or Aurelia. However, after Azir Relia took a bunch of other nerfs and was eventually forced out of the meta, Voice of the Risen would also take a break from relevancy. While you think Voice of the Risen's story would end there, she would eventually find her way back into the meta as an important enabler for Echo decks. Once Echo received enough support and got a buff to make it easier for him to level up, Voice of the Risen would serve as a key finisher to allow your board of previous weaklings to swing for lethal damage. If your opponent managed to kill your board, Echo's Chrono Break would make the trade unfavorable and sometimes be game-winning. At number 7, we have Rumble, which was released back in the Magical Misadventure expansion at the end of 2021. While Rumble did technically get a slight buff, which made meeting his level up condition a bit easier, I felt his inclusion on the list was worthy, as the deck he ultimately found success in didn't really make use of that buff and went in a totally different direction. Rumble felt a little bit awkward design-wise, as he wanted to try supporting multiple different things with Mecha Yordles and discard synergies, and he ultimately fell out of place in decks that wanted to use either one of those mechanics. Mecha Yordles weren't initially viable on their own, and discard synergies much preferred using Scion or Jinx alongside Draven as their champions. Rumble would mainly see play in a niche deck that paired him with Demacia to try and cheese multiple attacks with him. It wasn't until Vayne got released in October the year afterwards that this deck became more consistent and was considered a viable option. The deck was fairly one-dimensional. It focused on getting Rumble out quickly, and forcing him to attack a bunch of times before the opponent could find time to muster a proper answer. A 5/4 quick attack and spell shield meant that it was hard to defend against him or remove him, and if you added Overwhelm to him with Great Hammers, Blade Fragments, or Might, it meant that chump blocking Rumble to stall wouldn't be an effective counter either. Eventually, multiple different cards within the deck would find some nerfs, like Vayne, her Tumble, and Legionary Charge, which severely diminished Rumble's effectiveness and consistency in being able to constantly catapult him into the opponent. At number 6, we have Zolani the Bloodweaver. She was introduced during the Darkened Saga finale World Ender as a payoff to the Empowered keyword. Zolani would theoretically allow you to find the game-winning effect if you could transform her into Zolani Aspect's Bane, and then attack with a board with a couple of other followers. While there was a narrow meme deck which tried to use her alongside Azir, Domination, and cards that would buff Sand Soldiers, she was never too consistent enough to be able to flip at a fast enough rate to turn the game in your favor. That all changed when Siren Song released over a half a year later. The song was a 4-mana spell which would allow you to buff all your 1-mana units everywhere by +1/+1 and summon a free Husk. This would quickly turbocharge Zolani if you built your entire deck with generating Husks or summoning 1-mana units in mind. It wasn't unrealistic for Zolani to be transformed by turn 7 and win on the spot if you managed to play Siren Song early on. Thanks to Siren Song, there were a couple of decks that Zolani found herself in, ranging from Fizz Reaver's Row Targon, Evelyn Targon, and even Aatrox Bilgewater. However, after Siren Song took its nerf to 6 mana a month later, she hasn't been able to find as much competitive play since. At number 5, we have Regis Acolyte, which was released alongside Xerath all the way back in the Beyond the Bandlewood set. The idea behind this card was to make a 2-mana unit that could scale up forever if you were willing to prematurely destroy your own landmarks, which Xerath and Ziggs both appreciated. However, this was not usually feasible, as destroying your initial landmarks you spent mana on would have you lose out on potential value, and lining up landmarks to sacrifice was sometimes inconsistent and difficult at times. It also wasn't feasible since under most conventional circumstances, you could only have 6 effective copies of a Regis Acolyte in your deck, that being the 3 natural Acolytes and 3 copies of Construct of Desolation. This meant your theoretical infinite scaling had a limited ceiling. Regis Acolyte would then find success over a year later when direct support in the form of Acolyte's Reliquary was printed. Originally at 1 mana, the Reliquary would not only supply you a new Acolyte, but a cheap landmark for it to destroy. This would let you quickly scale up your Acolytes without any value lost, nor too much tempo sacrificed. Afterwards, another Reliquary would then be created in the top 5 cards of your deck, meaning you could repeat this process pretty often, and the problem would get out of hand fairly quickly for your opponent. This strategy proved to be too degenerate and effective, and would eventually receive a hotfix nerf a week later, something that doesn't happen too much in LOR. While this early hotfix nerf meant that neither the Regis Acolyte nor the Reliquary saw any tournament play, the Acolyte itself still felt like a worthy inclusion to this list due to the fact that how much it terrorized the ladder within that 1 week after being irrelevant for over a year. At number 4, we have Starlet Epiphany, a card that was released in the Rise of the Underworlds expansion at the end of the Empires the Ascended set. Spending 3 mana to invoke is already below rate, and then the option to turn your deck into Behold the Infinite wasn't something that was much appreciated, as this meant you'd have to spend an effective 2 mana tax on all of your future cards that you need to generate. This would not see any play until Sump Monument and Cosmic Call were introduced years later in 2023. The Epiphany would then play a part of a potentially back-breaking defensive combo with the Monument. After you would take a ton of damage and have multiple shrooms shuffled into your deck, you could then use the Epiphany to completely replace that deck and then be effectively guaranteed to buy yourself another turn thanks to the Puff Caps vanishing. Then, thanks to Cosmic Call, everything you would invoke from the future Behold the Infinites would not be as costly to play thanks to the halved mana reduction the call provided. This would allow you to quickly turn the game around if you found big cards from Invoke like the Scourge or Living Legends. At number 3 we have Scrap Dash Assembly. This was one of the first cards that were released to LOR, as it was part of the initial Foundation set. While Scrap Dash Assembly was in the game for a long time, it never saw any real or wide use play until many years later when 1. Seraphine released, 2. Samira was released, and 3. The standard Eternal Rotation split happened. All of these factors lining up together led it to find some use in the Eternal deck known as Plaza Printer. The deck's goal was to level up Seraphine as soon as possible, and then it would use that leveled up Seraphine as a way to duplicate many copies of Plaza Guardian with cheap spells like Blood for Blood and Iterative Improvement, and to help alleviate leveling up Samira and getting multiple rallies from her ability. The Scrap Dash Assembly was mainly used as a one-of to help turbocharge Seraphine level up and reduce Plaza Guardian's cost. The 1/1 served well as early chump blockers against big units, or could trade against aggressive decks using X1s. In the mirror, it could also provide early chip damage too, which could quickly add up. While Scrap Dash never became a main focus of a deck like other cards on this list, it most likely would have never had any hopes of top cutting in major tournaments unless Plaza Printer existed. At number 2 we have Double Trouble. This 3 mana spell was released in Rising Tide and didn't see play until Nami's release over a year later. It became a corner piece of Nami strategies because the original Nami wanted players to build up spell mana for the first 2 rounds. Then you would try and use that spell mana without using any unit mana on that 3rd turn to turbo level her by round 4. While random 1-drops does sound bad, and there are some low rolls, the 1-drops could serve as chump blockers that could either trade or stall until you found your Nami, and if Nami came down on board, Nami could potentially buff them into some very real threats with only a couple of spells. Eventually Nami was nerfed, and her strength and popularity both dwindled, and with it, the prevalence of Double Trouble would also follow in that trend. However, independent from Nami, Double Trouble would make a brief return with the release of the previously mentioned Siren Song, a much maligned card which would warp the game as quickly as turn 3, turning 1-drops into very real threats. While there were a ton of different Siren Song decks in the form of Fizz, Lucian, Evelyn, and many others that were mentioned, Double Trouble itself didn't find play in all of those decks. It mainly saw use in aggressive lists, especially when paired with Reaver's Row. Eventually, as mentioned earlier, Siren Song was hit with a nerf a month after its release, and with Nami's recent rework, which forces her to be more proactive with cheap spells instead of stalling and building spell mana for her to reach level 2, it is unlikely for Double Trouble to see any main deck play in the current state of the game at higher levels of competition. And at number 1, we have Powder Pandemonium. This spell was part of the first Champion expansion, which gave us Aphelios back during the Call of the Mountain release. During that mini-set, every other non-Targon region also got a neat tool, and Powder Pandemonium was what Bilgewater got. As the only card on the list to get nerfed, you would think that it must have been good for a long time, but it did take a while for it to eventually find a strong footing in the meta and become deserving of that nerf. While it was originally at 4 mana, and had the ability to give enemies vulnerable for the round each time you plundered, it wouldn't be considered for any serious play until Swindle got printed many sets later. While Powder Pandemonium lists became a fairly strong aggressive niche option after Swindle's inclusion, it wouldn't truly explode onto the meta until Samira's package release later during the Glory in the Vori set in 2023. This expansion gave Noxus a strong plunder package, which let it be a strong finisher for some Samira lists in Standard. This critical mass of plunder cards being released shot it up into the Stratosphere, where it would eventually find its first nerf to 5 mana later during the Glory and Navori launch, as a potential preemptive measure to curb the Pandemonium's power level down. Eventually, Powder Pandemonium would be hit with another nerf in the Glory and Navori miniset, where it would lose its ability to give enemies vulnerable as well. Despite these initial nerfs, Powder Pandemonium would find its way into some version of Fizz Samira lists, which skipped out on other finishers like Shelly, and took a more aggressive approach to kill the opponents with Powder Pandemonium. After wreaking a ton of havoc, it would later find a second nerf all the way to 7 mana during the Heart of the Huntress expansion. It still saw some play in that deck in Standard, but after Fate's Voyage release, it hasn't been as popular as it was in the past. Well, there's my list for the top 10 bad cards that eventually became good. If there's any cards you felt could have made the list, let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this list and have suggestions for other lists, I'd be open to seeing those in the comments too. If you enjoyed this kind of content or want to see other Runeterra content on YouTube, please consider liking and subscribing. It'd be greatly appreciated.